we're going to go over snapping, pivot points, and axis orientation. Snapping can be very helpful when you are placing objects or changing your pivot points. The easiest snapping to do is to snap to grid. You have these magnets up here, and if you click on the first one, it is snap to grids. If you turn that on, you can see that the move manipulator changed from being a square in the center to being a circle. This means that you have some snapping turned on. And when you go to drag it, it will jump between the grid intersections. If you click it again, it will turn off. The hotkey to turn that on is X. You have to hold it down, and when you release, snapping will be turned off. Going to make another object. And next, let's go over vertex snapping. It is the third magnet, which is snap to points. In this case, points are vertices, and the hotkey for it is V. If you hold down V, as in vertex, it will snap to whichever vertex you drag it to. It can be any object in the scene, in the front or back of the object. This can be very helpful when you are placing objects and trying to line them up perfectly. Sometimes you'll want to move your pivot point as well. When you move, rotate, scale, or snap an object, it will do all those things from the pivot point. Moving the pivot point is very easy. If you hold down D, as in dog, you will be able to move just your pivot point. You can drag it on an arrow or select it from the center and move it wherever you want. It will now rotate from that location, as well as scaling and moving. If you want to reset your pivot point, you can come up to Modify Center Pivot, which I have hotkeyed to A, or you can hit this button right here, which is Center Pivot. And that will bring it back to the center of your object. Moving your pivot can be very nice. However, right now it looks like it is aligned with that vertex. But if I rotate my camera, we can see that it's actually pretty far away. If you want to snap your pivot point, you can use your normal snapping tools. I'm going to hold down D and V at the same time, and now it will snap to a vertex. It can snap to any vertex in the scene. Likewise, you can also hold down D and X and snap to a grid. I'm going to hit A to center my pivot. That will not work by default, but you can set it in the hotkey manager. Finally, let's go over axis orientation. By default, your orientation for your move, rotate, and scale are going to be aligned with the world, meaning that these arrows line up with one of the grids. This can be just fine for most of what you're doing. However, if you want to move this object in the same orientation that it is rotated at, that will be very difficult. You could try to free move it, but that would not be very accurate. What you can do instead is change between world and object orientation. And there's a few ways you can do that. I'm going to double click on the Move tool, and that will open up my tool settings. And at the very top, we have axis orientation. And I'm going to change that from world to object. And you can see that it is now rotated at the same degree as my object, and I can very easily move it. There is a hotkey to do that much easier. If you hold down W and hold down left click, you have object and world. Sometimes that will not work, and when it will not work is when our transformations are frozen. You can see that for rotate X, it says 45, meaning it is at a 45-degree angle, and that is what the object orientation is using to determine how to change the pivot point. If we freeze our transformations, which is this button right here that says 0, 0, 0, or come up to Modify Freeze Transformations, you will see that 45 goes away, and it is back to default, 0, 0, 0 for Translate and Rotate. And now, even though we are in Object Orientation, we cannot get that pivot point to change. Fortunately, there is a very easy way to fix it. If you hold down D and just click on a face, it will align to that face. You can also click on an edge and it will align to that edge or to the vertex. To get out of this custom pivot point, hold down W, hold down left click, and go back to World. Or you can open your Move settings and change your axis orientation back to World or Object. And then to recenter your pivot point, you can hit the Center Pivot button. If you have two or more objects, there are a few different things you can do to make manipulating them a little bit easier. If I just marquee select both of them, they will rotate around their own pivot points. This object has a pivot point right in the center. This object has a pivot point in the corner. You can see that they rotate in slightly different ways. With both of them selected, if I move my pivot point, I'm holding down D and V to snap to vertex, I can move it to any vertex I want, and now both objects will rotate around that one pivot point. And that's because that I changed both of the pivot points at the same time to that same exact location. If I need to have a very specific pivot point for an object, it needs to be in that corner and it needs to be in the center, but I still want to rotate these objects together, you can create a group, and a group will have its own pivot point. So I'm going to select these two objects, hit Ctrl G, and you can see that the group pivot point is right at 0, 0, 0. A group pivot point will always be at 0, 0, 0, regardless of where the objects are. And now with the group selected, I can hold down D and V, and I can rotate them as I normally would, and their original pivot points are unaffected. So you can have different pivot points for your objects and for your groups. A very helpful feature of groups is a way to quickly select them. If I just select an object that is in the group, I'm not going to be selecting the group itself. I'm selecting the individual objects. If I marquee select, I will only get the objects. I will not have the group selected. For any group, you can select an object in the group and hit the up arrow on the keyboard, and you will now have that group selected, and you'll be able to manipulate the group instead of an individual object. If you hit the down arrow, you will have the first object in the group selected.